Thanks. So the title for my presentation today contains the word future. So the presentation consists of a fair amount of hand-waving, obviously. I'll try to substantiate it with past examples where possible. A few more words about myself. As it was already told, I'm a researcher and CEO at Possible Security. And some of the presentations I'd like to mention that I've done in the past is Hacking the Combos, which is presented in Hack in the Box, and the Toll of Personal Privacy, which is more high-level social presentation at 35C3. Now, let's get to it. Let's talk about threat profiles. I myself personally have had a huge problem with threat profiles not more than 10 years ago. I was trying to protect myself against every imaginable threat. And what I didn't understand back then is that you can't fully protect against everything because you need infinite amount of resources. And unfortunately, we have a different than infinite amount of resources available to our protection. So we actually have to prioritize. And as many of you know, threat profiling depends on who you are, what you do. So, for example, a ministry being attacked by a fancy bear is one thing. A school being attacked by pupils doing funky stuff to your hardware is a different thing. So you have to prioritize and you have to profile your threats. Now, one more theoretical slide. Software. Where does your software come from? Now, in making this presentation, I tried to create a graph of percentages of sources of software that we use, but unfortunately I couldn't find any reasonable data that does that quantitatively. So what I have instead is how many different countries do you think your software comes from? And again, for each of us it's going to be a different number. For those of you who are using open software, open source, Linux, for example, Linux alone, GNU Linux, the operating system, comes probably from 50, maybe 60, maybe 70 countries because of all the different developers from different countries collaborating. And there are different legislations for each country. And that will be an important part later. Now, 0 days are, of course, software vulnerabilities that are yet unknown to the vendor. Just to make sure that you are aware that it's still relevant, here are some 0 days. I'm not going to talk about them, but as you see by the ID numbers, they keep happening every year. Those of you who are maybe not following the 0 day market, 0 days happen, they will keep happening. And there's a bunch more companies. I just took a couple popular ones here. Now, a fix against vulnerability is, of course, a security patch, but security patch will fix a vulnerability only when both of these things happen, one after another. First, the vendor has to notice the vulnerability to create a security patch. And second, more importantly, the user has to install the patch. So only then will a security patch be effective. Now, what I'd like to show you is a comparison between what vendor does with a bug, with a security vulnerability, and what an attacker does. Attacker is in the red, of course, vendor is in the blue. So here's an example of a 0 day being discovered and exploited. Attacker discovers a bug. Some time is needed to write the exploit. Sometimes for easy bugs, it has taken me 30 minutes. For hard bugs, it can take a couple days, maybe even more, maybe a week or two. And then attacker can start exploiting the bug actively. And the quieter the attacker is, the harder it is for someone to notice that the bug's being exploited. So unless you start blasting everyone with your 0 day, it can go on for a long time. Now, the vendor, on the other hand, will at some point discover the bug, will publish a patch, and then we have this long window of user actually applying the patch. Now, one thing that may happen is, of course, that the exploit may be burned by attacker not using it in a careful manner, and then vendor gets notified immediately that active exploitation is going on, and this process is a bit more positive for the vendor and the users. Now, what security patches do is, of course, save users from existing vulnerabilities. They mean squat for 0 day mitigation. They don't do anything against those because that's what 0 day means, as I just explained. Also, interestingly, security patches allow attackers to develop 1 days. Now, 1 day is a different kind of story. Here we have a different slide. So a vendor has discovered a bug, and the vendor has published a patch. And what an attacker does immediately, they reverse engineer the patch to create so-called 1 day. And if they publish it immediately, as soon as the patch is out, that's a 1 day. Many users still haven't patched the system. and they can still exploit those users. So that's a different thing that we have to consider. And finally, security patches do one more thing. They may introduce new vulnerabilities, like in this picture here. So the old AC wasn't powerful enough, so they removed it from the window and placed a more powerful AC nearby, and now we have a security hole. In real life, in IT. So for example, here we have Scott Shortridge talking about fixing, or rather discovering bug in XIM that was fixed, and then a new bug appears only in the fixed version. Stuff like that happens. I've been doing some research on Microtik, which is not the topic of this presentation, but here's a slide from one of the presentations on Microtik Router OS. It describes different bugs and when they have been patched. And there's this one really nice bug at the very right side, and the bug is in how they store the user passwords. If someone gets access to the file system, what they can do is they can easily reverse the password, because they say it's unreversible, it's unhackable. And they do use a hash function, they do use MD5. To be fair, not a good hash function, but still. The algorithm is they take the username, they add that string over there, take an MD5 of that, and then XOR the result with the password. That's how they protect the password, and they didn't patch that. But they did implement a new system. They did implement a more secure storage of passwords, but for backwards compatibility, they still stored both of those encryptions in the files. So you had this old bug encryption, and you had the super cool elliptic curve cryptography encryption. Finally, they moved away from that. Finally, they told users, if you can update to this version, we're going to delete your old password and it's going to be fine. You know, it's not going to be there. But if you ever downgrade to a version before that bug was pointed out by myself, you will lose your passwords and everyone will be able to log in. So, I mean, it's a no-win situation. They had to do something, so they did it. But when you do the downgrade, password is removed. So what researchers did is they noticed that HTTP is being used for getting the latest version. So you can, intercept that request and say that latest version is like not 6456, like in this example, for example, 641, which, doesn't have the secure password and password is removed. So that's not the way how we can introduce vulnerabilities when patching. Now, but main problem is, of course, that users are slow, so that's why we have automatic patching. Android, iOS, mobile devices where I'd say, first, if we talk about mass market products, but we also see Windows, we see other operating systems, and we see, of course, we've seen for a long time commercial specific like networking products using automatic patching. And that, of course, means that the user doesn't have to interact to install the patch, which is good, which means that we move this application of patch really, really closely to publishing the patch. But it may be not the same day. For example, if we look at iOS infrastructure, a user will get a push for an iOS update a day later, maybe 2 or 3 days later, because of the sheer amount of devices. So there's still a window for attacker to exploit, but it is, of course, better, right? Well, let me talk about a different kind of threat. I'd like to point out right here that for the rest of the presentation, NSA is a figure of speech. Other countries also have agencies. There are well-funded criminal groups and so on. So actually, probably most of this doesn't apply to maybe who knows, right? But there are agencies and criminals. So. There was this unit at NSA called Tailored Access Operations. Rumors are that they changed the name after Snowden leaks. And what they could do is they can hack you any way they want, basically. So they have the best people and they do the lowest level, the most hardcore hacks. Sometimes they also make vulnerabilities if needed. Not the TAO specifically, but NSA. Like, for example, this random generator, dual elliptic curve, which was discovered to be at least insecure, maybe backdoored, of course, Diffie-Hellman, and many more. So, stuff like that happens and we have to deal with that. But I'd like to make a small detour here. Remember how in Snowden leaks, those of you who saw some pictures on the internet, they used this nice graphic, SSL is being removed and added here. Well, in November, the actual NSA published this document. It's publicly available. It's universally accessible, and they have a new logo for SSL removal. I really appreciate the triangle and the eye over there. But NSA distrusts patches. Remember, NSA is not NSA; it's a figure of speech. So they would verify the patch first, I imagine, and patch later. They wouldn't just blindly patch because, no one knows what's in the patch. We've seen examples. I've showed you examples of patches actually containing more vulnerabilities than they're trying to fix. Okay, but let's put the tailored X operations aside. In the United States, there are also national security letters. And again, this can also be considered a figure of speech because, there are different countries, different procedures. As far as we know, in the United States, national security letters are used basically to simply request information. But what if, under the table, it's being used to request more? And I'm positive that other mechanisms for requesting a company to do something and be silent about it exists around the world. Also, you can't disregard the chance of large companies, large suppliers being infiltrated by both government agents and criminal group agents. That is a real possibility, and it has happened before. But NSA also loves patches because patches have amazing damage potential. Now, let me give you some examples so you don't think that it's pure fiction. This just happened. Security researchers at Spider Labs discovered a malware campaign distributed through emails saying that please update your Windows, this is a new, better version, and it's malware. Well, but the delivery channel is email, so there's nothing important, nothing serious. Let's take a look at something where delivery channel was an update. But let's start at a less serious note. So VLC for iOS. Anyone uses that? It's an app that allows you to play videos. So what they did, because of some legal dispute, they pushed an updated version that removed a codec and only acknowledged that in the next update following that, in the changelog. So I would consider that malicious purpose as a user. I mean, there are legal things in there which I'm not going to touch, but as a user, that's a malicious update to me. Then we, of course, have, for example, this case where attackers abused credentials of a software company to publish a bad version that contains malware, and it happens a lot. It's happened with many different tools. Maybe Pure FTPD is one of the more well-known examples, but it happens all the time. And of course, who doesn't remember the FTDI? They did it twice, actually. Well, no one thought they did it again, but they did it twice. So they used Windows Update. One of those cases, they used Windows Update to actually automatically push a driver update that would brick devices, well, counterfeit devices. Once again, the legal part on that may be gray, but it's a malicious update. So the potential is clearly there. Okay, but it's not all that bad. We have to remember that if someone decides to use mechanisms like that en masse, then it immediately would burn that specific access vector. Also, it would undermine all the work that we as security experts have been doing all these past years, telling users first to update and then to install automatic updates. Because, then they would be getting malicious updates. But you have to keep in mind that targeted attacks are still a concern, depending on what is that you do. What is your threat profile? Now, to make sure that you understand how prevalent zero-days actually are and how easily accessible they are, let's talk about zero-day market a bit. So there are multiple companies. Wupen founded Zerodim, so that's out of the market. Wupen is out. But we have the other companies, and Immunity is a different Immunity, not the one that we have. We have a sponsor booth over there. That's a different one, I think. So you have these companies, and Hacking Team is still alive, which is surprising, but they are, that buys or researches, depending on the company profile, 0 days, and then rents or sells them. Now, from leaked documents about a bit more than 5 years ago, we see that the actual prices for a partner, as they're called, to access these 0 days is not that high. I mean, you'd think the prices are high, because if you look, for example, at this chart of what Zerodim pays researchers, and here for Windows RCA, Windows Remote Code Execution without any clicks, maximum payment is $1 million US. And I'm not even talking about mobile, which goes up to $2.5 million, depending on the vector and the chain. But at least more than 5 years ago, what you had to pay to get access to that was quite low. It was, in most cases, the documents that leaked had had prices under $100,000 a year to access this infrastructure and to access these resources. And I mean, it makes sense. They buy it once and then resell it to, 100 governments, some of them which are oppressive, some of them maybe are, torturing people, who knows. So it is a strange conundrum we're in, actually, when you talk about zero-day market. On one hand, we need those 0 days for some cases, like child exploitation sometimes cannot be effectively solved without using some 0 days and direct attacks. And there have been some successful attacks against Tor, for example. Some of them were to combat drug markets. Some of them were against child exploitation specifically. So it is needed, but at the same time, there is no control. So that's why we had the Wassenaar agreement and so on, but it's a different story. So, okay. Let me give you a solution. And that was the serious part of the talk, because, I'm not here to sell a product, and even if I would, I don't have a product. I haven't fixed anything. I just found the thing, and it's a problem. So I have some ideas on what we can do to work in the right direction and to move away from patching and find something else. Let me remind you the first slides again, just so it's clear. When someone's going to watch this on YouTube and then go to their, CEO will go to their CISO and tell, we don't need patches, let's save the money. No, that's not the point. Most of us need patches. Depending on your threat profile, it may be more prudent to not install patches and do something else. In some rare cases. So, what I present to you, and I added the slide because I need the name. I'm going to refer to this solution in the next, in the coming slides. So I just need the name, and what I had is 0 days with dynamic evaluation and detection. That's the name I have. That's the acronym I have for my product. Well, it's not a product, for my idea here. Okay. So, the solution. I never thought that I'd say that. I never thought that I tell an audience, hey, let's use the cloud. But, the cloud, in broader sense, can actually provide something here. So we can, and we are already doing that as an industry. We are automatically sharing attack signatures using different vendor tools. That's already happening, and that's good. And cloud enables that. What we are also doing in small part, but we should grow that part, is using machine learning to detect less careful attacks. We are using heuristics right now a lot. It's not exactly machine learning per se. So machine learning can be, in my opinion, used to make sure that most of the attacks get prevented. Now, speaking of less careful attacks, I mentioned less careful attacks here because if the attack is perfect, there's nothing you can do. Forget it. They're going to hack you, right? If there are some mistakes, there is something you can do. And do these threat actors that I'm talking about here, agencies of different countries, criminal groups with lots of manpower and intelligence, do they actually make mistakes like that? Well, yes, they do. For example, the Trident exploit. It was an exploit chain of 3 exploits, and it was valid for all these versions of Apple iOS, from version 7.0 to version 9.3.4. That's multiple years of devices being updated every day. Every time an update comes out, and still being vulnerable to the attack. Now, some of you know the story, right? How the chain was burned. So there was a journalist who received a text message, an SMS, saying, hey, click this malware link. Well, basically. And the thing is, the journalist was a victim of being attacked specifically, directed at him 2 previous times already. So he had contact with a cybersecurity company, and he, of course, didn't click the link and forwarded it to the company. And that's how the exploit, all the 3 exploits got burned. And it was around 4 or 5 years ago, I think. And at that point, what I saw was something amazing. Apple, that's usually super slow to patch. Let's forget what they did in September and October now with iOS. But Apple, that's usually slow to patch back then, fixed it in 10 days. They patched all 3 exploits and they pushed the update in 10 days, which was an amazing response time. So it was really critical to them, apparently. But the point is, attackers tend to be negligent, especially in a zero-day market where the people developing the exploits or the people selling the exploits are not the people using or abusing the exploits. So, what we're looking for is something like an antivirus, but it would be an antivirus for a network monitor device. It would be an antivirus running on a honeypot. It would be an antivirus running on a network tab, but it's not an antivirus. It's like an antivirus, right? So it would use machine learning. Oh, I feel like I'm selling snake oil right here, right now. So they use machine learning to try and understand if there is any executable data in where that should be non-executable data only, and some other algorithms, right? But let's talk about antiviruses first, right? Would you agree that antiviruses are on the decline, that we see less and less antiviruses being used, being recommended by cybersecurity experts? Some of you have maybe seen that. So what has happened to the antivirus market? And it's important to understand that if we are going to propose using something like the antivirus again. So for the most part, antiviruses do no good if the user is careful, right? Firewall is super useful. Remember Windows XP before Service Pack 2? You were installing it, connect to the internet. By the time you finish your installation, you have already got some malware in your Windows XP. Firewalls are nice and dandy. For antiviruses, they mostly protect the second line of defense, so to say, or third. After the firewall, after the user, then we have the antivirus. Now, and they mostly don't protect against 0 days. I've seen Kaspersky, which is a Russian antivirus company, advertising that their antivirus has on numerous occasions stopped this 0 day, that 0 day, so found a bug that no one had found before. Probably it's true, but it's not the rule. It's an exception. It's luck. So mostly they don't protect against 0 days, and they also provide extra attack service. There has been research into antiviruses. The first one was in 2006 already. A researcher described the potential for antiviruses to not protect the system, but to actually increase the attack surface of the system by the virtue of antivirus being vulnerable itself. And we also have some new research that has happened in the past 3 years. Google Project Zero, Tavis wrote these lines. These vulnerabilities are as bad as it gets. They don't require any user interaction. They affect the default configuration. And the software runs at the highest possible privilege, which is, of course, what antivirus does. And before that, there was also research which was titled "Killed by Proxy Analyzing Client and TLS Interception Software," but it was in large part about antivirus, because that's part of what antivirus does. It intercepts data before it accesses the app. Now, one more thing. What about non-network attack vectors? Remember, we are talking about these actors that are really sophisticated. And if any of you have by any chance looked at these leaks of Snowden of the tailored access operation, you will see that many of their vectors that they use do not have anything to do with software at all. So how do we protect against those? Well, again, we need on-device tools, so antivirus has to go back on the device, but it has to be a different antivirus. It has to look for commands in data space, and it has to analyze all input channels. Traditional antivirus analyzes what? Network and disk, basically, right? Including external disks. But this tool, if we want to protect us from threats that we haven't detected yet, has to analyze everything. And that includes, on the lowest level, what's going on the USB bus, right? Maybe the malware is not on the disk, maybe it's not on the file system that you plugged in, maybe the malware is in the hardware side of the USB device itself. ATA for hard drives, network, fireware, HDMI, everything. So I feel like we're back in the 80s, when antiviruses were becoming popular. I see that this is where it's going. I'm not sure, but I would believe that that some agencies are probably already implementing or have implementing something like that for their in-house use to protect against unknown malware. And from one side, it's really nice to see that they are giving back to the community. Anyone has used Ghidra by the NSA, reverse engineering framework? I haven't. I've downloaded it just to make sure that if they change the version silently, I can compare the hash and see what changed. Because I published it what appeared to be in a hurry, but probably I'm wrong. But still we have this distrust, right? Those are the guys that, at least part of them, try to hack us. So, okay. But I think some of them may have the software, and I would really look forward to them sharing their insights, because this is all, as I promised, hand-waving. Now, finally, I do recognize that there is or rather, there are some problems with this proposal. Namely, we are not getting rid of the extra attack surface. Antiviruses provide such a large additional attack surface to an attacker in part because they are really complex pieces of software. Now, this new idea, 0xDead, that I'm proposing, is going to be even more complex if anyone tries to implement it. So it will certainly provide extra attack surface, and that has to be recognized. We'd simply move exploitability away from the apps and the operating system to this one choke point. But again, that's good because then we can work on security over there. At the same time, we get something new compared to an antivirus. If that gets implemented in any reasonable technical way, not on the level I'm presenting here, then we may gain some protection against directed unpatched vulnerabilities. So what some people call as APTs, right? Advanced persistent threats. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that's gonna end, or how that's gonna start, how that's gonna be implemented. This presentation was brought to you by me talking to people for 2 years and warning them, but bad guys could use automatic updates to screw your shit up. So that's it. Thank you.